The fog was thick as it rolled over the small, secluded village of Milford, a place where time seemed to stretch into the horizon, and secrets were hidden behind closed doors. Milford had always been quiet, a charming hamlet surrounded by dense woodlands and narrow country lanes. It was the kind of place where people knew each other's names and business, where everything seemed ordinary until the night of the crime. The incident took place at the home of the respected local historian, Professor Richard Blakesley. He had long been a fixture in the community, known for his impeccable reputation and vast collection of rare manuscripts. His manor, nestled at the edge of Milford, was as old as the surrounding trees, its rooms filled with the scent of aged paper and polished wood. It was in one of these rooms, the study, that the crime occurred. At first glance, it seemed like an ordinary evening. Blakesley had invited a few friends for dinner, a mixture of fellow scholars and a couple of younger academics who admired his work. Nothing about the gathering seemed out of the ordinary. However, when dinner was over and the guests were about to leave, Blakesley was found slumped over his desk, motionless and pale, his hand still clutching a pen. The room was locked from the inside, and the only visible clue was a strange pattern on the desk, a series of spirals drawn in what appeared to be ink. The local police were baffled. There was no sign of forced entry, no weapon, no struggle. Blakesley's guests had all been present throughout the evening, and no one could account for how he had died. His colleagues were interviewed one by one, but each story seemed to check out, and yet the mystery deepened. The autopsy revealed something peculiar. Traces of poison had been found in Blakesley's bloodstream, but the poison was unlike anything the local doctors had encountered before. It had not been administered in a typical manner. There was no mark on the skin, no ingestion of food or drink that could explain its presence. The doctors were at a loss, and the mystery only grew more perplexing. In the days that followed, the manor was scoured for clues, but what the investigators found only added to the confusion. The strange ink spirals on Blakesley's desk were not just a random scribble. They appeared to form a riddle, but no one could decipher it. The words, "The ink is the poison is the ink," were scrawled in uneven, frantic strokes, yet it seemed to make no sense. Why would Blakesley write such a thing? And how had the ink been poisoned? The investigation reached a dead end. The local police had no answers, and the case seemed to hang in the air like the fog outside. But then, the one person who might have been able to solve the mystery arrived, Miss Jane Marple. Miss Marple was not a typical detective. She was an elderly woman, small in stature and unimposing in appearance, but sharp in mind and keen in observation. Her reputation for solving the most complex of crimes preceded her, and when word of the baffling case reached her, she wasted no time in arriving at Milford. The villagers had mixed feelings about her visit. Some were skeptical, others hopeful. But no one could deny that Miss Marple had a reputation for cracking the unsolvable. Her presence alone brought a sense of anticipation to the small village. The first thing Miss Marple did upon arriving at Blakesley's manor was to examine the study where the crime had occurred. The room had been preserved as it was on the night of the murder, the desk still littered with papers and books, the ink-stained blotter in place. Miss Marple's keen eyes scanned the scene methodically. She noted the faint traces of ink on Blakesley's fingers, the way his body had slumped so unnaturally over the desk, and of course the strange spirals in the ink. She took a moment to study the ink. It was unlike any typical ink used for writing. There was something odd about its texture, its sheen. She ran a finger through a small puddle of the ink that had spilled over the edge of the desk. It was thick, almost viscous, and it left an unusual residue on her fingertip. The ink itself is the key, she murmured to herself, her mind already piecing together fragments of the puzzle. But how did it end up here? Miss Marple turned her attention to the rest of the room. The locked door, the untouched window, and the position of Blakesley's body all suggested that the crime had been meticulously planned. Or perhaps that it was an accident waiting to happen. It didn't take long before she noticed something subtle, something the others had missed, the faint scent of something sweet mixed with the musty odor of old paper. It was the scent of almonds. Almonds were often associated with cyanide, a notorious poison that was both deadly and difficult to detect. Miss Marple's mind raced, but then she caught herself. Not cyanide. Something else, she whispered under her breath. A sudden thought struck her. What if the poison wasn't in the food or drink? What if the poison had been hidden in the ink itself? She called for a closer inspection of the ink, and after testing it in a nearby lab, her suspicion was confirmed. The ink had been laced with a rare and highly potent toxin, one that could be absorbed through the skin. Blakesley's death hadn't been an accident. It had been deliberate. But who would go through such lengths to poison the ink? Miss Marple's mind turned over the possibilities. The answer was right in front of her. The riddle, the strange spirals. Drawn in the ink was a message, an invitation to solve the mystery. And the more she thought about it, the clearer it became. The answer lay not just in the ink, but in Blakesley's past. Miss Marple would have to dig deeper into Blakesley's life, his work, and the people closest to him if she were to uncover the identity of the killer. The clock was ticking, and the mystery of the poisoned ink was far from solved. But Miss Marple was determined to get to the truth, no matter how complex or elusive it seemed. Miss Marple spent the next few days quietly, observing, listening, and piecing together fragments of information. The villagers had long since assumed the authorities would solve the crime, but she knew better. The investigation was stalled, caught in the web of conflicting testimonies, the mystery of the locked room, and the perplexing clue of the ink. She sat in the drawing room of the manor, a delicate china teacup in her hand. Her mind remained firmly focused on the puzzle. The guests, who had been present on the night of the dinner, had all been questioned by the local constables, but Miss Marple sensed that something about them was off. Each had a plausible alibi. No one had been anywhere near Blakesley's desk after dinner, and yet the ink was poison. One of them had to be involved, but she wasn't ready to make any assumptions yet. Her thoughts were interrupted when Inspector Lawrence Roberts, the head of the local investigation, arrived at the manor to update her on the latest developments. He was a young man, still eager to prove himself, and although he was competent in his own right, Miss Marple could tell that he was somewhat frustrated by the lack of progress. "Miss Marple, thank you for your patience," Roberts said as he walked into the drawing room, his brow furrowed. "We've questioned the guests again, and none of them seem to have any answers that make sense. The poison is so unusual. No one knows where it came from. And the ink, well, it's just too strange. I have a feeling we're missing something." "Obvious." Miss Marple gave him a gentle smile. "Inspector, sometimes it's the smallest detail that reveals the truth. We must not overlook the little things." She paused, setting down her teacup and standing slowly. her hands clasped behind her back. "Now I'd like to take another look at the study. Perhaps there's something there that's been overlooked." Roberts agreed, and together they made their way upstairs to Blakesley's study. The room had remained unchanged since the night of the murder. The desk was still cluttered with papers, the ink blotters untouched. The faint scent of almonds still lingered in the air, though it was weaker now, and the spirals of ink on the desk were as cryptic as ever. Miss Marple's sharp eyes scanned the room with a focused intensity, while Roberts busied himself with checking over the obvious places: the drawer handles, the shelves, the floor. It was then that Miss Marple's gaze fell upon something that no one else had noticed. A small, peculiar object tucked beneath a stack of books at the far end of the desk. She walked over and picked it up carefully, turning it in her hands. It was a small, ornate bottle, no larger than a thimble, made of deep blue glass. The stopper was tightly sealed, and there was something about it that didn't seem to belong in such a scholarly environment. She could sense the faintest trace of something unusual about it, a residue on the neck of the bottle that hadn't been wiped away. "Inspector," she called softly, holding up the bottle for him to see. "What do you make of this?" Robert stepped forward, his brow furrowing as he examined the bottle. "That's odd. I didn't see that before." He reached for it, but Miss Marple stopped him. "Be cautious, Inspector. We don't know what it is yet," she said, her tone more cautious than usual. She set the bottle down carefully on the desk and, after a moment's thought, reached into her bag for a small magnifying glass. She peered closely at the neck of the bottle, and there it was, a faint, powdery residue. "This, I believe, is no ordinary bottle of perfume or ink. There's something more to it." Roberts, now clearly intrigued, stepped closer. "You think it's connected to the poison?" "I do," Miss Marple said quietly, her mind already whirring with possibilities. "But we need to confirm it. The residue is too specific to be accidental." She turned to the inspector. "I believe this bottle might be the key to understanding how Blakesley was poisoned. We need to test it immediately." It wasn't long before the laboratory confirmed Miss Marple's suspicion. The bottle contained a rare, concentrated form of toxin, one that could be easily absorbed through the skin. It was a poison that had been used in only a few high-profile cases in recent years, making it even more unusual. This was no ordinary crime. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure Blakesley's demise. The revelation raised even more questions. How had the bottle ended up hidden beneath the pile of books? Who had placed it there? And why had it been left in such a conspicuous yet hidden spot? It seemed that someone was trying to cover their tracks, perhaps too carefully. The investigation unfolded. Miss Marple began to turn her attention to the guests who had been present that fateful evening. There were 5 in total, and each of them seemed to have a motive for wanting Blakesley dead, or at the very least for being involved in his death. But none of the stories fit the pieces of the puzzle perfectly. Something was off, and Missy Marple was determined to figure out what it was. She began her interviews with the most likely suspect in her mind, Professor Edward Carrington, a younger academic who had been Blakesley's closest colleague. Carrington had often been seen in Blakesley's company, and the two had shared a contentious relationship over the years, with rumours swirling about Carrington's growing frustration with Blakesley's influence in the field. "Professor Carrington," Miss Marple began, her voice soft and even as she sat across from him in the drawing-room. "What can you tell me about your relationship with Professor Blakesley?" Carrington, a tall man with sharp features and a nervous energy about him, seemed uncomfortable at the question. It was professional, mostly, he said, his fingers tapping on the arm of his chair. We disagreed on several matters, but nothing that would lead to something like this. Miss Marple observed him closely. His eyes darted around the room as he spoke, a small but telling sign of agitation. But she wasn't ready to jump to conclusions. She simply nodded and allowed the conversation to continue, her gaze never leaving his face. And you were with the other guests all evening? She asked. Carrington hesitated. Yes, of course. She leaned forward slightly, her voice low but insistent. No one left the dining room at any point. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his mouth twitching into a tight smile. No, we all stayed together. Miss Marple's eyes remained fixed on him. There was something in his response that didn't quite sit right with her. A brief hesitation, a slight unsteadiness in his words. She'd have to dig deeper into his background, into his relationship with Blakesley, before she could draw any conclusions. But the first signs of deception were beginning to surface. As Carrington's interview concluded, Miss Marple knew the next steps would be crucial. There were more puzzles to solve, and the picture was only starting to come into focus. The bottle, the strange residue, the spirals of ink, they were all pieces of the same enigma. But who had left them and why? That was the question that still needed to be answered. The next morning, Miss Marple sat at the dining table sipping her tea and reflecting on the interviews she had conducted. Each guest at the dinner had told a version of the evening that seemed plausible on the surface, but as Miss Marple had learned in her long years of solving mysteries, truth often lay between the lines of what was said and what was left unsaid. The contradictions she had observed were subtle, but they were there, like faint ripples in still water. Inspector Roberts had organized another round of questioning, and Miss Marple was present for each one, her keen eyes watching every nuance, every shift in posture, every flicker of emotion. She had already begun to notice the cracks in the suspects' stories. The guests had been questioned individually, but their answers seemed rehearsed, almost too tidy, as if they had all agreed on what they would say before the police arrived. My first conversation that morning was with Dr. Sylvia Grant, a middle-aged woman with a sharp intellect and an air of composure. She was a historian who had collaborated with Blakesley on various projects over the years. They had shared a mutual respect for one another, or so it appeared to Miss Marple, but something about Dr. Grant's demeanour seemed slightly off. Her answers were too precise, as if she were carefully constructing a narrative rather than recounting events. Dr. Grant, Miss Marple began softly, her voice soothing. I understand you were seated next to Professor Blakesley during dinner. Can you tell me about the evening? Dr. Grant's lips tightened slightly as she glanced down at her hands. Yes, of course. It was a lovely evening. Blakesley was in good spirits. We spoke about his recent work on ancient manuscripts. There was nothing unusual about the evening. Miss Marple observed her closely. Dr. Grant's voice lacked the warmth one might expect when recalling an evening spent with a respected colleague. The words were correct, but the emotion behind them seemed forced. You were all in the same room, I presume, when Professor Blakesley passed away? Miss Marple asked, her gaze unwavering. Dr. Grant nodded, her face betraying nothing. Yes, we were all together. We didn't hear anything out of the ordinary. I didn't know anything was wrong until the others discovered him at the desk. We tried to help, of course. Miss Marple paused, letting the silence stretch between them. And when you were told that Professor Blakesley had been poisoned, how did you react? Dr. Grant's eyes flickered for a moment, just the briefest flash of something Miss Marple couldn't quite place. The reaction was subtle, but it was there. The doctor's response came quickly, almost too quickly. I was shocked, of course. How could anyone harm such a man? The way she said it, the slight emphasis on the word anyone, set off a small alarm in Miss Marple's mind. She asked a few more questions, but Dr. Grant's answers remained guarded. She was evasive, not in the overt way of someone trying to hide a secret, but in a quieter, more insidious way. She was hiding something. Miss Marple could sense it, but she couldn't yet say what it was. The next interview was with Marcus Blake, a younger historian, and one of Blakesley's protégés. Blake was nervous, his hands trembling slightly as he spoke, but he was quick to cooperate, almost too eager to help in his own way. He was the one who had first discovered Blakesley's body when the dinner had ended, and his story matched that of the others in every way. Too neatly. "Marcus," Miss Marple began, her tone as soft as ever, "I understand you were the one to find Professor Blakesley." Blake's face tightened at the mention of it, but he nodded. "Yes, I was. It was dreadful. I didn't know what to do. I called for help immediately." Miss Marple studied him carefully, noting the way his eyes darted to the side as he spoke, the slight tremor in his voice. "And when you found him, was there anything unusual in the room? Any sign that someone had been there before you?" Blake hesitated for a moment too long. "No, nothing. Just Blakesley." It was as if he'd simply collapsed. He seemed to hold his breath, as if hoping his answer would satisfy her. Miss Marple smiled gently, though the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "How well did you know Professor Blakesley, Marcus? I understand you've worked with him for a few years." Blake's face softened, and there was a brief flicker of admiration in his eyes. "Yes, I respected him immensely. He taught me so much. He was like a mentor to me." Miss Marple studied him for a moment longer, the lines of his face betraying a vulnerability. He seemed earnest, but there was something slightly too perfect about his reactions, something rehearsed. She wasn't convinced. It was as though he was trying too hard to present himself as the dutiful, distressed scholar. The eagerness to cooperate, the haste to portray innocence, it all felt slightly exaggerated. Next came Evelyn Draycott, A.E., young and ambitious writer who had recently befriended Blakesley. She had attended the dinner as part of her aspiration to gain favor with the older man, hoping his influence could help her career. Unlike the others, Draycott was unnervingly calm as she spoke about the events of the evening. "Miss Draycott," Miss Marple began, "I understand you were seated near Professor Blakesley. Can you tell me about the dinner?" Draycott's smile was serene, almost detached. "Yes, of course. It was a pleasant evening. Blakesley spoke to all of us about his latest work. We all laughed, discussed literature, the usual topics. He seemed in good spirits." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "And did you notice anything unusual about his behavior? Anything out of the ordinary?" Draycott's eyes flickered for a split second before she answered, "No, nothing at all. He was completely himself." "But after the dinner," Miss Marple pressed, "when you learned that Blakesley had been poisoned, how did you feel?" Draycott's response was unsettlingly flat. "Shocked, of course. I couldn't believe it. Why would anyone want to harm him?" Miss Marple watched her closely. The reaction was textbook, too impersonal, as if it was a line Draycott had rehearsed. The lack of genuine emotion unsettled Miss Marple. She was hiding something, but what? Perhaps it was more than just an attempt to distance herself from the crime. It was as if Draycott was trying to prevent anyone from seeing the truth. She was hiding something deep within her, something she was determined not to reveal. As Miss Marple moved through the remaining interviews, it became increasingly clear to her that each guest was holding back, but in different ways. Dr. Grant's quiet evasion, Blake's overeager cooperation, and Draycott's lack of emotion were all pieces of a larger puzzle. Each person had a different version of events, but none of them were consistent. The contradictions were small, but they were there, and Miss Marple was beginning to see a pattern forming. The poison, the bottle, the ink. It all pointed to something, more than just a simple crime of passion. Whoever had committed the murder had carefully manipulated the scene, covering their tracks and playing the others like pawns. The clues were in the details, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover the hidden motives behind their words. She knew now that the final pieces were close at hand. There was more to this crime than anyone realized. The deception was thick, but it would unravel soon enough. Miss Marple sat in the dimly lit drawing room, the shadows of late afternoon creeping across the floor as she reflected on the tangled web of motives surrounding Professor Blakesley's death. The interviews with the suspects had only deepened the mystery. Each one of them had some form of connection to Blakesley, some personal, others professional, but no clear motive had yet emerged that could explain everything. The more she thought about it, the more it became apparent. The crime was a puzzle, with multiple pieces, each with its own reason to be part of the whole, but none of them fit together neatly. The initial shock of the murder had faded, but the emotional undercurrents remained. Dr. Sylvia Grant had been Blakesley's colleague for years, and there had been rumors of a growing tension between them in recent months. Dr. Grant had felt passed over, sidelined by Blakesley's increasing obsession with his latest project. She was no stranger to ambition, and the thought of being eclipsed by someone she once considered a friend could very well have driven her to desperate measures. But still, Miss Marple thought, that didn't fully explain her cool demeanor or the way she seemed to carefully construct her responses to the questions. Then there was Marcus Blake, the young historian who had revered Blakesley as a mentor. His admiration, though sincere, had borders that were not immediately clear. There were whispers that Blake had resented Blakesley's control over his career, the way his mentor had chosen the direction of his research, leaving little room for his own ideas. Was it possible that Blake had killed Blakesley in a burst of frustration, believing that the older man had stifled him for too long? But Blake had seemed too eager to please during the questioning, almost desperate to convince Miss Marple of his innocence. That eagerness, she knew, often hid something more sinister. If he was guilty, he wasn't showing it in the way she expected. His behavior was like a well-practiced act, but behind it lay something Miss Marple couldn't quite pin down. Then there was Evelyn Draycott, the young writer with her detached demeanor. She had come into Blakesley's circle as a recent acquaintance, seeking his influence to further her career. But what if it wasn't simply career ambition that had led to his death? What if Blakesley had seen through her, recognizing her ambition as more self-serving than genuine, and had begun to shut her out? Draycott was intelligent enough to know that she could never make her mark if Blakesley stood in her way. The idea of being dismissed by him, cast aside as a fleeting distraction, might have made her desperate enough to act. But even then, something didn't feel quite right. She seemed too calm, too poised. If she were guilty, why had she stayed so composed? Miss Marple rose slowly from her chair, the tension in her body unwinding as she paced the room. It seemed there was no clear path through the maze of possible motives. Each of the suspects had reason to want Blakesley dead, but none of them had provided the crucial clue that would link them definitively to the murder. She thought of the poison, the rare concentrated toxin found in the bottle hidden beneath the books in Blakesley's study. Whoever had used it must have known exactly what they were doing. It was a poison that could be easily absorbed through the skin, and while it was difficult to trace in small amounts, the residual traces on the bottle made it clear that it had been handled by someone. But who? And why had they chosen this particular method? The ink, the bottle, the carefully orchestrated positioning of the victim's body, it was all too calculated to be the result of an impulsive crime of passion. This was a premeditated murder executed with precision. The timing of Blakesley's death was also telling. It had happened after the dinner in a locked room, with the other guests apparently unaware of the danger. No one had witnessed anyone entering the study, and yet someone must have slipped in during the evening unseen to poison the ink. The locked door seemed to suggest that the murderer was one of the dinner guests, someone who had known the room well enough to gain access without raising suspicion. Miss Marple felt the weight of the situation pressing on her, and in that moment, the pieces of the puzzle began to slowly shift in her mind. She turned to the small table by the window, where a stack of papers lay, each one containing notes from her interviews. She picked them up one by one, rereading them with renewed focus. As she examined the alibis and connections, she noticed a small detail that had eluded her before. Dr. Grant, despite her calm exterior, had mentioned something about Blakesley's recent work during their interview. She had been far too specific about it, almost as if she knew what he had been working on without having been directly involved. Blake, too, had been careful in his recounting of events, but his familiarity with Blakesley's movements was a bit too detailed for someone who had merely found the body. The initial shock of the murder had faded, but the emotional undercurrents remained. Dr. Sylvia Grant had been Blakesley's colleague for years, and there had been rumours of a growing tension between them in recent months. Dr. Grant had felt passed over, sidelined by Blakesley's increasing obsession with his latest project. She was no stranger to ambition, and the thought of being eclipsed by someone she once considered a friend could very well have driven her to desperate measures. But still, Miss Marple thought, that didn't fully explain her cool demeanour or the way she seemed to carefully construct her responses to the questions. Then there was Marcus Blake, the young historian who had revered Blakesley as a mentor. His admiration, though sincere, had borders that were not immediately clear. There were whispers that Blake had resented Blakesley's control over his career, the way his mentor had chosen the direction of his research, leaving little room for his own ideas. Was it possible that Blake had killed Blakesley in a burst of frustration, believing that the older man had stifled him for too long? But Blake had seemed too eager to please during the questioning, almost desperate to convince Miss Marple of his innocence. That eagerness, she knew, often hid something more sinister. If he was guilty, he wasn't showing it in the way she expected. His behaviour was like a well-practiced act, but behind it lay something Miss Marple couldn't quite pin down. Then there was Evelyn Draycott, the young writer with her detached demeanour. She had come into Blakesley's circle as a recent acquaintance, seeking his influence to further her career. But what if it wasn't simply career ambition that had led to his death? What if Blakesley had seen through her, recognizing her ambition as more self-serving than genuine, and had begun to shut her out? Draycott was intelligent enough to know that she could never make her mark if Blakesley stood in her way. The idea of being dismissed by him cast aside as a fleeting distraction, might have made her desperate enough to act. But even then, something didn't feel quite right. She seemed too calm, too poised. If she were guilty, why had she stayed so composed? Miss Marple rose slowly from her chair, the tension in her body unwinding as she paced the room. It seemed there was no clear path through the maze of possible motives. Each of the suspects had reason to want Blakesley dead, but none of them had provided the crucial clue that would link them definitively to the murder. She thought of the poison, the rare, concentrated toxin found in the bottle hidden beneath the books in Blakesley's study. Whoever had used it must have known exactly what they were doing. It was a poison that could be easily absorbed through the skin, and while it was difficult to trace in small amounts, the residual traces on the bottle made it clear that it had been handled by someone. But who and why had they chosen this particular method? The ink, the bottle, the carefully orchestrated positioning of the victim's body. It was all too calculated to be the result of an impulsive crime of passion. This was a premeditated murder, executed with precision. The timing of Blakesley's death was also telling. It had happened after the dinner in a locked room, with the other guests apparently unaware of the danger. No one had witnessed anyone entering the study, and yet someone must have slipped in during the evening, unseen, to poison the ink. The locked door seemed to suggest that the murderer was one of the dinner guests, someone who had known the room well enough to gain access. Without raising suspicion, Miss Marple felt the weight of the situation pressing on her, and in that moment, the pieces of the puzzle began to slowly shift in her mind. She turned to the small table by the window, where a stack of papers lay, each one containing notes from her interviews. She picked them up one by one, rereading them with renewed focus. As she examined the alibis and connections, she noticed a small detail that had eluded her before. Dr. Grant, despite her calm exterior, had mentioned something about Blakesley's recent work during their interview. She had been far too specific about it, almost as if she knew what he had been working on without having been directly involved. Blake, too, had been careful in his recounting of events, but his familiarity with Blakesley's movements was a bit too detailed for someone who had merely found the body. The initial shock of the murder had faded, but the emotional undercurrents remained. Dr. Sylvia Grant had been Blakesley's colleague for years, and there had been rumors of a growing tension between them in recent months. Dr. Grant had felt passed over, sidelined by Blakesley's increasing obsession with his latest project. She was no stranger to ambition, and the thought of being eclipsed by someone she once considered a friend could very well have driven her to desperate measures. But still, Miss Marple thought, that didn't fully explain her cool demeanor or the way she seemed to carefully construct her responses to the questions. Then there was Marcus Blake, the young historian who had revered Blakesley as a mentor. His admiration, though sincere, had borders that were not immediately clear. There were whispers that Blake had resented Blakesley's control over his career, the way his mentor had chosen the direction of his research, leaving little room for his own ideas. Was it possible that Blake had killed Blakesley in a burst of frustration, believing that the older man had stifled him for too long? But Blake had seemed too eager to please during the questioning, almost desperate to convince Miss Marple of his innocence. That eagerness, she knew, often hid something more sinister. If he was guilty, he wasn't showing it in the way she expected. His behavior was like a well-practiced act, but behind it lay something Miss Marple couldn't quite pin down. Then there was Evelyn Draycott, the young writer with her detached demeanour. She had come into Blakesley's circle as a recent acquaintance, seeking his influence to further her career. But what if it wasn't simply career ambition that had led to his death? What if Blakesley had seen through her, recognizing her ambition as more self-serving than genuine, and had begun to shut her out? Draycott was intelligent enough to know that she could never make her mark if Blakesley stood in her way. The idea of being dismissed by him, cast aside as a fleeting distraction, might have made her desperate enough to act. But even then, something didn't feel quite right. She seemed too calm, too poised. If she were guilty, why had she stayed so composed? Miss Marple rose slowly from her chair, the tension in her body unwinding as she paced the room. It seemed there was no clear path through the maze of possible motives. Each of the suspects had reason to want Blakesley dead, but none of them had provided the crucial clue that would link them definitively to the murder. She thought of the poison, the rare concentrated toxin found in the bottle hidden beneath the books in Blakesley's study. Whoever had used it must have known exactly what they were doing. It was a poison that could be easily absorbed through the skin, and while it was difficult to trace in small amounts, the residual traces on the bottle made it clear that it had been handled by someone. But who? And why had they chosen this particular method? The ink, the bottle, the carefully orchestrated positioning of the victim's body, it was all too calculated to be the result of an impulsive crime of passion. This was a premeditated murder, executed with precision. The timing of Blakesley's death was also telling. It had happened after the dinner in a locked room, with the other guests apparently unaware of the danger. No one had witnessed anyone entering the study, and yet someone must have slipped in during the evening, unseen, to poison the ink. The locked door seemed to suggest that the murderer was one of the dinner guests, someone who had known the room well enough to gain access without raising suspicion. Miss Marple felt the weight of the situation pressing on her, and in that moment the pieces of the puzzle began to slowly shift in her mind. She turned to the small table by the window, where a stack of papers lay, each one containing notes from her interviews. She picked them up one by one, rereading them with renewed focus. As she examined the alibis and connections, she noticed a small detail that had eluded her before. Dr. Grant, despite her calm exterior, had mentioned something about Blakesley's recent work during their interview. She had been far too specific about it, almost as if she knew what he had been working on without having been directly involved. Blake, too, had been careful in his recounting of events, but his familiarity with Blakesley's movements was a bit too detailed for someone who had merely found the body. The initial shock of the murder had faded, but the emotional undercurrents remained. Dr. Sylvia Grant had been Blakesley's colleague for years, and there had been rumours of a growing tension between them in recent months. Dr. Grant had felt passed over, sidelined by Blakesley's increasing obsession with his latest project. She was no stranger to ambition, and the thought of being eclipsed by someone she once considered a friend could very well have driven her to desperate measures. But still, Miss Marple thought, that didn't fully explain her cool demeanour or the way she seemed to carefully construct her responses to the questions. Then there was Marcus Blake, the young historian who had revered Blakesley as a mentor. His admiration, though sincere, had borders that were not immediately clear. There were whispers that Blake had resented Blakesley's control over his career, the way his mentor had chosen the direction of his research, leaving little room for his own ideas. Was it possible that Blake had killed Blakesley in a burst of frustration, believing that the older man had stifled him for too long, But Blake had seemed too eager to please during the questioning, almost desperate to convince Miss Marple of his innocence. That eagerness, she knew, often hid something more sinister. If he was guilty, he wasn't showing it in the way she expected. His behavior was like a well-practiced act, but behind it lay something Miss Marple couldn't quite pin down. Then there was Evelyn Draycott, the young writer with her detached demeanour. She had come into Blakesley's circle as a recent acquaintance, seeking his influence to further her career. But what if it wasn't simply career ambition that had led to his death? What if Blakesley had seen through her, recognizing her ambition as more self-serving than genuine, and had begun to shut her out? Draycott was intelligent enough to know that she could never make her mark if Blakesley stood in her way. The idea of being dismissed by him, cast aside as a fleeting distraction, might have made her desperate enough to act. But even then, something didn't feel quite right. She seemed too calm, too poised. If she were guilty, why had she stayed so composed? Miss Marple rose slowly from her chair, the tension in her body unwinding as she paced the room. It seemed there was no clear path through the maze of possible motives. Each of the suspects had reason to want Blakesley dead, but none of them had provided the crucial clue that would link them definitively to the murder. She thought of the poison, the rare, concentrated toxin found in the bottle hidden beneath, the books in Blakesley's study. Whoever had used it must have known exactly what they were doing. It was a poison that could be easily absorbed through the skin, and while it was difficult to trace in small amounts, the residual traces on the bottle made it clear that it had been handled by someone. But who? And why had they chosen this particular method? The ink, the bottle, the carefully orchestrated positioning of the victim's body, it was all too calculated to be the result of an impulsive crime of passion. This was a premeditated murder, executed with precision. The timing of Blakesley's death was also telling. It had happened after the dinner, in a locked room, with the other guests apparently unaware of the danger. No one had witnessed anyone entering the study, and yet someone must have slipped in during the evening, unseen, to poison the ink. The locked door seemed to suggest that the murderer was one of the dinner guests, someone who had known the room well enough to gain access without raising suspicion. Miss Marple felt the weight of the situation pressing on her, and in that moment, the pieces of the puzzle began to slowly shift in her mind. She turned to the small table by the window, where a stack of papers lay, each one containing notes from her interviews. She picked them up one by one, rereading them with renewed focus. As she examined the alibis and connections, she noticed a small detail that had eluded her before. Dr. Grant, despite her calm exterior, had mentioned something about Blakesley's recent work during their interview. She had been far too specific about it, almost as if she knew what he had been working on without having been directly involved. Blake, too, had been careful in his recounting of events, but his familiarity with Blakesley's movements was a bit too detailed for someone who had merely found the body. The initial shock of the murder had faded, but the emotional undercurrents remained. Dr. Sylvia Grant had been Blakesley's colleague for years, and there had been rumours of a growing tension between them in recent months. Dr. Grant had felt passed over, sidelined by Blakesley's increasing obsession with his latest project. She was no stranger to ambition, and the thought of being eclipsed by someone she once considered a friend could very well have driven her to desperate measures. But still, Miss Marple thought, that didn't fully explain her cool demeanour, or the way she seemed to carefully construct her responses to the questions. Then there was Marcus Blake, the young historian who had revered Blakesley as a mentor. His admiration, though sincere, had borders that were not immediately clear. There were whispers that Blake had resented Blakesley's control over his career, the way his mentor had chosen the direction of his research, leaving little room for his own ideas. Was it possible that Blake had killed Blakesley in a burst of frustration, believing that the older man had stifled him for too long? But Blake had seemed too eager to please during the questioning, almost desperate to convince Miss Marple of his innocence. That eagerness, she knew, often hid something more sinister. If he was guilty, he wasn't showing it in the way she expected. His behavior was like a well-practiced act, but behind it lay something Miss Marple couldn't quite pin down. Then there was Evelyn Draycott, the young writer with her detached demeanour. She had come into Blakesley's circle as a recent acquaintance, seeking his influence to further her career. But what if it wasn't simply career ambition that had led to his death? What if Blakesley had seen through her, recognizing her ambition as more self-serving than genuine, and had begun to shut her out? Draycott was intelligent enough to know that she could never make her mark if Blakesley stood in her way. The idea of being dismissed by him, cast aside as a fleeting distraction, might have made her desperate enough to act. But even then, something didn't feel quite right. She seemed too calm, too poised. If she were guilty, why had she stayed so composed? Miss Marple rose slowly from her chair, the tension in her body unwinding as she paced the room. It seemed there was no clear path. Through the maze of possible motives, each of the suspects had reason to want Blakesley dead, but none of them had provided the crucial clue that would link them definitively to the murder. She thought of the poison, the rare, concentrated toxin found in the bottle hidden beneath, the books in Blakesley's study. Whoever had used it must have known exactly what they were doing. It was a poison that could be easily absorbed through the skin, and while it was difficult to trace in small amounts, the residual traces on the bottle made it clear that it had been handled by someone. But who? And why had they chosen this particular method? The ink, the bottle, the carefully orchestrated positioning of the victim's body. It was all too calculated to be the result of an impulsive crime of passion. This was a premeditated murder, executed with precision. The timing of Blakesley's death was also telling. It had happened after the dinner, in a locked room, with the other guests apparently unaware of the danger. No one had witnessed anyone entering the study, and yet someone must have slipped in during the evening unseen to poison the ink. The locked door seemed to suggest that the murderer was one of the dinner guests, someone who had known the room well enough to gain access without raising suspicion. Miss Marple felt the weight of the situation pressing on her, and in that moment the pieces of the puzzle began to slowly shift in her mind. She turned to the small table by the window where a stack of papers lay, each one containing notes from her interviews. She picked them up one by one, rereading them with renewed focus. As she examined the alibis and connections, she noticed a small detail that had eluded her before. Dr. Grant, despite her calm exterior, had mentioned something about Blakesley's recent work during their interview. She had been far too specific about it, almost as if she knew what he had been working on without having been directly involved. Blake, too, had been careful in his recounting of events, but his familiarity with Blakesley's movements was a bit too detailed for someone who had merely found the body. It wasn't just her reaction, though. It was the way she answered almost too carefully, with no trace of panic. Miss Marple knew that kind of calm, It was the calm of someone who had already decided what they wanted the world to believe. The authorities, eager to make an arrest, turned their attention to her, convinced that they had their answer. But Miss Marple couldn't help but feel that something was amiss. The vial was damning, certainly, but it didn't tell the whole story. There was something about the way the other suspects were reacting too. Blake, for instance, had grown increasingly nervous. The weight of suspicion seemed to bear down on him, and though he had been quick to answer questions before, now he fumbled over his words, his anxiety spilling out in every direction. He denied any involvement, but the way he flinched at every mention of Blakesley's work only deepened Miss Marple's suspicion. It was Evelyn Draycott, however, who intrigued her the most. Draycott had remained quiet throughout most of the renewed questioning. She seemed less concerned with the police's newfound certainty than the others, but it wasn't that she was calm. There was something more to her detachment, a sense that she wasn't particularly surprised by the developments. She knew something that the others didn't, and Miss Marple could feel the pull of that unspoken knowledge. Was Draycott trying to distance herself, or was she waiting for the right moment to reveal something important? Still, Miss Marple's attention remained on the vial. Its sudden appearance had too many coincidences, too much precision. The authorities were now certain that the case was closed, and they were ready to make an arrest. But Miss Marple knew that the real criminal wasn't going to be caught that easily. She had learned long ago that the appearance of a breakthrough often obscured the truth. She visited the study again later that day, taking a slow, deliberate walk through the room. The bookcase that Blakesley had spent so much time cataloguing, the desk where he had written his final manuscript, all seemed undisturbed by the chaos of the investigation. As Miss Marple examined the room, her eyes were drawn to a small, half-open drawer on the desk. It hadn't caught her attention before, but now it seemed out of place. The drawer was too tidy, too orderly, and yet something about it felt like a whisper, a hint of something important left behind. She opened it carefully, her heart racing as she sifted through the contents. Papers, letters, notes, nothing out of the ordinary. But then she found it. A scrap of parchment, folded into a neat square, was tucked in the back of the drawer. It was a torn piece of Blakesley's last manuscript, one that had been carefully hidden. It was a rough draft, but one that Miss Marple could make sense of. The lines were messy, disjointed, but there was something important here, something that had been intentionally overlooked. The manuscript contained fragments of Blakesley's final thoughts on his work, but they were more than just scholarly musings. They revealed the central theme of his research, a discovery so profound, so dangerous, that it could have brought down powerful people in the academic world. There were names hidden in the margins, references to colleagues who had betrayed Blakesley for financial gain. And one name in particular stood out, Marcus Blake, his protégé, who had been vying for a position at Blakesley's side in the academy. The discovery hit Miss Marple with the force of a sudden realization. The vial, the hidden messages, and the carefully laid traps, they had all been part of a plan to make sure the truth never saw the light of day. The authorities had rushed to celebrate their success, but they were too quick to declare victory. The true mastermind had remained in the shadows, watching as their false victory unfolded. Blake had thought himself clever. He had made sure that the vial would lead back to Dr. Grant, who had always been on the periphery of Blakesley's research. But the vial had been a distraction. Blake had planted it there to draw suspicion, away from his own involvement. He had done it for the most personal of reasons: ambition. Blakesley had been a mentor, but he had also been a barrier to Blake's own success. And in the end, Blake had decided that the only way to secure his future was to ensure Blakesley's demise. The true nature of the crime was clear to Miss Marple now, and she knew exactly where the next step of the investigation would take her. She turned, her resolve steadying as she prepared to reveal the truth behind the false victory. Miss Marple had spent hours pondering the new pieces of the puzzle, her thoughts circling back to the hidden manuscript and the scrap of paper she had found in Blakesley's desk. The truth was clearer now, but one thing still nagged at her. The undercurrent of tension between the suspects wasn't just born from the present circumstances. It seemed to have roots in something older, something long buried, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the answers she sought were tied to a forgotten case, one that was lurking in the shadows of the past. As she sat by the fire that evening, the flickering flames casting long shadows across the room, a memory surfaced, one she hadn't considered until now. It was a case she had been involved in years earlier, a case that had been dismissed by most as a simple affair of academic rivalry. At the time, Miss Marple had thought little of it, but now, in the light of recent events, the connections between that old case and the present one were starting to reveal themselves. The case in question had involved a scandal among academics in the very field that Blakesley had excelled in. Several scholars had fallen under suspicion for their involvement in the fraudulent sale of ancient manuscripts. It had been a scandal that rocked the academic world at the time, though no one had ever been truly held accountable. It was considered an embarrassing chapter in the history of scholarship, one that most had hoped would be forgotten. But as Miss Marple thought back to those events, she remembered something peculiar. One of the scholars involved in the scandal had been a colleague of Blakesley's during his early career, a man named Horace Liddell. Liddell had vanished from the academic scene years ago, his name now little more than a whisper in the halls of academia. Most believed that he had retreated into private life after the scandal, but what if the story hadn't ended there? What if the past was still very much alive in the present? Miss Marple leaned forward, her fingers brushing over the edge of the fireplace. She thought of Blakesley's own rise to prominence, the way he had distanced himself from the scandal that had once threatened his career. Was it possible that Blakesley had known something about Liddell's involvement in the thefts, something that had led him to sever all ties with his former colleague? And if that were the case, could there be a link between Liddell's mysterious disappearance and Blakesley's murder? The more Miss Marple turned this over in her mind, the clearer it became. Liddell's disappearance had been no accident. Blakesley, with his keen intellect, had probably uncovered something that no one else had, the true nature of the manuscript thefts and the role Liddell had played in them. If Blakesley had been about to expose Liddell, or perhaps even implicate him in his latest research, it was no stretch to imagine that someone connected to Liddell might have wanted to silence him. She stood and walked over to the desk, gathering her thoughts before she made her way back to the scene of the crime. There was a connection here, a thread that she needed to pull, but she knew that doing so would not be without risk. As the evening wore on, she found herself unable to ignore the sense of urgency growing within her. She had to act quickly. The following day, she visited the local archives, a place she had often found to be a wellspring of forgotten stories. The dusty shelves were filled with old case files and academic journals, the remnants of a past long buried. It was here that she found the article she was looking for, the one that had mentioned Horace Liddell and the scandal that had nearly ruined his career. The article itself was unremarkable, nothing more than a brief mention of his involvement in the manuscript thefts. But as she read through it again, something caught her eye. A subtle detail, easily overlooked by anyone else, but to Miss Marple, it was a key to understanding the entire case. Liddell had once been a close associate of Dr. Grant, though their relationship had soured over the years. According to the article, Dr. Grant had been one of the first to publicly distance herself from Liddell when the scandal broke. She had accused him of being involved in the thefts, yet she had never explained how she had come to that conclusion. It had always seemed like a convenient way to remove herself from suspicion, but now, looking at it with fresh eyes, Miss Marple wondered if Dr. Grant's denunciation had been more than just a desperate attempt to clear her name. Could it be that Dr. Grant had known something about Liddell's connections to the stolen manuscripts? And if so, what was her role in it all? Miss Marple's mind raced as she pieced the fragments together. Dr. Grant's knowledge of the manuscript, thefts, her association with Liddell, and her recent tension with Blakesley. Could it be that she had been trying to cover up a dark secret from the past? What if Blakesley had discovered something about Dr. Grant's involvement in the thefts, something she had done years ago, and had used it as leverage to further his own career? In that case, it would make perfect sense for Dr. Grant to be the one to have committed murder in a desperate attempt to prevent Blakesley from revealing the truth. But Miss Marple wasn't so sure. She had seen too many motives, too many layers of deceit to accept such a simple explanation. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that Dr. Grant's involvement in the crime was only one part of the puzzle. There were others. People who had been present during the thefts. People whose pasts were tied to the manuscript scandals of long ago. The clues had begun to take shape in her mind, and as the pieces fell into place, she found herself drawn to one final, undeniable conclusion. The crime wasn't just about Blakesley's research, nor was it solely about the ambitions of his colleagues. It was about something deeper, something that had been buried in the shadows of the past. The people involved in the thefts, the manuscript forgeries, and the academic rivalries of years gone by were all connected. And now, someone had decided that the past couldn't be allowed to resurface. With this newfound clarity, Miss Marple knew that the real truth was even darker than she had imagined. The past was alive, lurking beneath the surface, and someone was desperate to keep it buried. Whoever that person was, they were still out there, waiting to make their move. As the days passed, Miss Marple's sense of urgency only deepened. She could feel the delicate strands of the investigation weaving together, but she wasn't quite there yet. There were too many layers, too many shadows lurking just beyond the reach of her understanding. The suspect's behavior was more than odd. It was calculated, deliberately designed to mislead. Yet among all the deceit, Miss Marple had learned that sometimes the smallest deviation, a single crack in the facade, was all she needed to expose the truth. She had watched them all carefully over the past few days, their movements, their expressions, the way they interacted with each other. She noticed how Blake's anxiety seemed to ebb and flow, how Evelyn Draycott's detachment was more than mere indifference. It was a carefully cultivated reserve. But it was during the most recent questioning that she had spotted something truly unsettling. Dr. Grant, whose calmness had always intrigued her, had flinched ever so slightly when asked about a detail from the past. It wasn't obvious, but Miss Marple had caught it, a twitch in her jaw, a brief hesitation. It was enough to make her wonder if the scholar had known more than she was letting on. But Miss Marple needed more than suspicion. She needed a way to break through the carefully constructed facades. The answer came to her in a flash, a simple yet unconventional tactic that would exploit the very thing the suspects were trying to conceal: their emotions. She decided to employ a strategy she had used once before in another case, one that had proven effective in unveiling the truth when the suspects thought themselves safe. It wasn't anything particularly dramatic, no grand confession or confrontation, but rather a subtle psychological trick. It was a way of manipulating their perceptions, putting them in a situation where their instincts would betray them. Miss Marple had them all gathered together under the pretext of revealing new evidence that had come to light. A supposed breakthrough in the case that would help the authorities decide who among them was responsible. The suspects were tense, eager for answers, but unsure whether to believe the claims of an older woman who seemed more interested in reading a book than conducting an investigation. When they entered the room, Miss Marple was sitting quietly by the window, her chair turned toward them, the dim light casting shadows over her face. She didn't speak at first, but her presence was enough to make them pause. It was as if they expected her to say something, but instead she remained silent, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. They exchanged glances, none of them willing to make the first move. Blake was the first to break the silence. "Is this really necessary, Miss Marple?" His voice was sharp, impatient, though the faintest hint of fear lingered beneath it. "We've already told you everything we know." Miss Marple gave him a small smile, but it was a knowing one, the kind that suggested she was on the verge of understanding something he hadn't quite grasped. "Of course, Mr. Blake. I'm sure you've been most forthcoming," she said, her voice soft but laced with something he couldn't quite place. Dr. Grant shifted uncomfortably beside him, her eyes darting toward the door. Evelyn Draycott, on the other hand, watched Miss Marple with an air of detached curiosity, as if she were waiting for something to happen. It was clear that the others had already become uneasy, and Miss Marple's calm presence seemed to unsettle them even more. "I've been thinking about the manuscript you found," Miss Marple said, her gaze steady on Dr. Grant. "It's fascinating, isn't it? The way Blakesley's final work was so carefully hidden. Such a brilliant mind, though perhaps a little too obsessed with secrets." The words hung in the air, and Miss Marple watched as Dr. Grant's expression flickered. For the briefest moment, there was something almost imperceptible in her eyes, an expression of discomfort, a tightening around her mouth. Miss Marple saw it, and she knew it wasn't just a reaction to the mention of Blakesley's work. It was something deeper, something more personal. "You seem to know quite a bit about Blakesley's methods, Miss Marple," Blake remarked, his voice tight with restrained annoyance. He was clearly trying to control his nerves, but it wasn't working. "Are you suggesting something about his research?" "Oh, not at all, Mr. Blake," Miss Marple replied smoothly, taking another sip of her tea. "I just think it's curious, the way Blakesley managed to keep everything so well guarded. He must have known that someone would eventually want to take his work for themselves. Perhaps that's why he was so secretive about it." Blake's eyes narrowed, his fingers twitching as if itching to defend himself, but Miss Marple didn't give him the chance. She turned her attention to Evelyn Draycott. "And you, Miss Draycott, you must have known Blakesley well, having worked so closely with him. Did he ever confide in you about his research?" Miss Marple's voice was as calm and disarming as before, but it carried a weight that made Draycott stiffen. Draycott's eyes flickered to the others before settling back on Miss Marple. Her lips pressed together, but the tension in her jaw betrayed her discomfort. "Blakesley was a private man," she said, her voice colder than before. "He kept his work to himself." "Interesting," Miss Marple murmured, her gaze never leaving Draycott's face. "You seem quite sure of that, though I wonder if there was ever a time when he might have shared something with you. Perhaps just a hint about his final manuscript." Draycott's eyes flashed briefly, then quickly masked with a perfect veneer of indifference. But Miss Marple could see it. Something had shifted. A crack had appeared in the carefully constructed wall, and for a brief moment Draycott had revealed a subtle but telling sign of guilt. She had reacted too quickly, almost as if the mention of Blakesley's final manuscript had hit too close to home. But Miss Marple wasn't finished. She shifted her attention to Dr. Grant, who had remained unnervingly still throughout the entire exchange. The older woman's eyes were now fixed on Miss Marple, and for a moment their gazes locked. There was a tension in the air, palpable and thick, as if both women understood that the truth was about to be uncovered. What if Blakesley hadn't just been concerned with secrets, but with something even darker? Miss Marple said softly, her tone casual but laced with a hidden threat. What if he had discovered something in his research that would have destroyed someone's career? Someone like, say, Horace Liddell? The effect was immediate. Dr. Grant's entire demeanor shifted, her face draining of color as if she had been caught in the act. Blake's hand gripped the edge of his chair, his knuckles white. Evelyn Draycott shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her eyes narrowing. The trap had been set. Miss Marple waited in silence, watching as the reactions played out before her. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. But in that brief moment, the pressure had cracked the carefully constructed facades. Dr. Grant's guilt was written across her face, and Blake's unease was palpable. And Evelyn, though quiet, was now paying far too much attention to Miss Marple's every word. The game had changed. No longer were they in control. Miss Marple had pushed them into a corner, and now the truth would emerge. The tension in the room was thick, suffocating almost. Miss Marple watched as Dr. Grant, her face pale and drawn, fidgeted uncomfortably with her sleeve, her eyes darting nervously to the others in the room. Blake, though trying his best to maintain a facade of composure, had shifted his weight in his seat, his hand tapping rhythmically against the table. Evelyn Draycott, once so poised and controlled, now seemed almost twitchy, her fingers drumming lightly on her thigh, her gaze flicking from one person to another, as if she were calculating her next move. The room was charged, and Miss Marple knew she had them. At least, she had them where she wanted them. But there was something nagging at the back of her mind, a whisper that told her this breakthrough wasn't going to come without its own complications. She had watched them all, long enough to know that they were more than capable of hiding the truth, that their deception ran deep. But now they were on the defensive, their carefully crafted lies starting to fray at the edges. It was then that the unexpected happened. As she prepared to press them further, an officer came into the room with a look of unease. He was young, a fresh face among the detectives, and his eyes were wide as he stepped forward. "Miss Marple, there's a problem." The words sent a ripple of confusion through the room. Miss Marple's brow furrowed slightly. "What is it?" she asked, her voice calm but sharp. "It's the manuscript. The one Blakesley was working on, the one you mentioned earlier," the officer continued, his voice quivering with a hint. of disbelief. It's gone. Completely vanished. We've checked everywhere, his office, his home, the archives, but there's no sign of it anywhere. A silence fell over the room, the kind of silence that precedes a storm. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat, her mind racing to keep up with the implications of what she'd just heard. This was no accident, she realized. The manuscript, the very thing that had tied everything together, had been taken, and someone had moved swiftly to make sure it was out of reach. "Are you certain?" Miss Marple asked, keeping her voice steady, though her mind was already working furiously. "Absolutely certain that no one overlooked it?" The officer hesitated for a moment, clearly flustered. "We searched everywhere, Miss Marple. We even checked the archives again, but it's as though it simply disappeared." A cold shiver ran down Miss Marple's spine. This wasn't just a theft. It was a calculated move to throw off the investigation, to bury the truth before it could be fully uncovered. Someone knew they were getting too close to something, and they had taken drastic action to stop it. Who had access to the manuscript? Miss Marple asked, her eyes narrowing as she shifted her gaze to the others in the room. Blake, who had been quiet up until this point, leaned forward, his expression tight. "Anyone could have accessed it, Miss Marple." Blakesley was well known for his liberal lending of materials to colleagues. "We all had a chance to see his work." Dr. Grant's lips pressed into a thin line, and Evelyn's face had turned an almost imperceptible shade paler. Neither of them spoke, but their silence spoke volumes. Miss Marple could feel the shift in the air, the growing weight of suspicion. "Interesting," she murmured, before turning her attention back to the officer. "Is there any sign of forced entry? Any clues as to how it was taken?" The officer hesitated. "No, Miss Marple. Everything was locked up tight. The only way in was through the back office, but we found no evidence of tampering there. It's as though someone just had the key." The words hung in the air. "The key," Miss Marple repeated, her mind working in overdrive. The thought had struck her with eerie clarity. Someone close to Blakesley, someone who had known exactly where the manuscript was behind this. But who? She rose from her seat and walked slowly over to the window, staring out into the garden, as if the answer might come to her from the quiet outside world. This wasn't just an ordinary crime of passion or desperation. It was a deliberate attempt to erase the truth, to bury it in the past where it couldn't be found. Someone was trying to hide something, and Miss Marple needed to find out what. That was before it was too late. "Could it be Dr. Grant?" Blake asked, his voice suddenly sharp with suspicion. She was always so secretive about her own work. What if she decided to destroy Blakesley's research to cover her own tracks? Miss Marple turned slowly, her gaze never leaving him. "I'm not so sure, Mr. Blake, but I think you may be onto something important," she said, her voice calm but pointed. "It's possible someone wanted to make sure that manuscript never saw the light of day again, and it's clear that whoever it was had no intention of letting anyone else discover the truth." Evelyn Draycott, her composure starting to crack, spoke up at last, her voice trembling slightly. But why would anyone go so far? Why would they risk everything just to keep something hidden? Miss Marple gave her a knowing look. Because what was hidden was worth more than anyone can imagine. The manuscript wasn't just research, my dear. It was a key to something much larger. Blake's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple hesitated, but only for a moment. It wasn't just Blakesley's work that had to be destroyed. It was everything. The people behind the thefts, the lies, the forgeries. They were all connected to something far more dangerous than anyone realized. The air in the room thickened again, as everyone seemed to hold their breath, each of them wondering how much further the detective would take them down the rabbit hole. The stakes had risen with this latest turn of events, and now, more than ever, Miss Marple knew the true gravity of what was at play. She turned back to the officer. "Have you found any traces of the manuscript? Anything at all?" The officer shook his head, but there was a note of uncertainty in his voice. "We'll keep searching, Miss Marple, but I don't have high hopes." Miss Marple's gaze flickered across the room, pausing on each suspect in turn. She knew that the answers she sought weren't going to come easily. The person responsible for taking the manuscript had thought they had won, that they had erased the last piece of evidence that might tie them to the crime. But Miss Marple was far from finished. This was only the beginning. "Don't worry," she said softly, her voice unwavering. "This isn't over yet." The room was still, the tension hanging heavy as the last words echoed in Miss Marple's mind. She was accustomed to playing a long game, waiting for the truth to emerge, for the threads to finally align into something tangible. But what happened next was a wrenching shift in the investigation, one that brought everything she thought she knew crashing down. It was early the next morning when the second blow struck. Miss Marple had been up late, poring over notes and re-examining the evidence, trying to make sense of the missing manuscript and the cryptic puzzle that had become the case. The cold, morning air still hung around her like a veil when the knock on the door came, urgent and sharp. "Miss Marple," the officer said, breathless as he burst into the room, "we've found something. I think you'll want to see this." A sinking feeling settled in Miss Marple's stomach as she followed the officer out of the room. His face was grim, his eyes haunted by something unspeakable. They hurried through the corridors of the station, the tension palpable in the air. As they reached the back of the building, Miss Marple's heart seemed to skip a beat when she saw the scene before her. There, lying motionless on the cold concrete floor, was Dr. Grant, her lifeless body sprawled at an unnatural angle. Blood pooled beneath her head, staining the floor a dark crimson, and her eyes, wide open in a final expression of shock, stared at the ceiling as if frozen in fear. The officer's voice trembled as he spoke. "We found her like this, just moments ago. There's no sign of struggle, but she's dead, Miss Marple. It looks like she was struck from behind. A blow to the head, perhaps." Miss Marple crouched down beside the body, her sharp eyes scanning every detail. The bloodstains seemed to be concentrated around Dr. Grant's skull, but there was no weapon in sight, no sign of any struggle. It was eerily clean, too clean. This wasn't the scene of a random attack, but rather a calculated move. Someone had killed her with precision. Who found her? Miss Marple asked, her voice steady, though a storm churned beneath the calm exterior. "Officer Taylor," the officer replied, glancing nervously at the body. He was on his way to check on the archives, and he saw her like this. Miss Marple nodded, her mind already whirring. Something didn't fit. Dr. Grant's death was too clean, too orchestrated. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a deliberate message. And as much as Miss Marple had feared, it was becoming clear. The real criminal was still out there, pulling strings and staying one step ahead of the investigation. She stood up slowly, her thoughts racing. The timing was too precise. "Dr. Grant, had been found at the same time the investigation had reached a critical point, and she was one of the few people who knew exactly how close Miss Marple had come to unraveling the truth. The killer wasn't just trying to cover up the manuscript. They were trying to stop Miss Marple herself. But why Dr. Grant? Why not someone more directly involved? As the officers began securing the scene, Miss Marple's gaze shifted toward the nearby archives room. She knew there was something there, something hidden beneath the layers of deception. The killer had been watching the investigation unfold, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And now, they had taken their shot. "I want to see the archives," Miss Marple said, her voice clipped with authority. "Immediately." The officer nodded and led the way. Though his movements were hesitant, his earlier certainty shattered. When they entered the room, Miss Marple's sharp eyes immediately caught sight of something strange. A file cabinet, its drawers slightly askew. She walked toward it without a word, her hand reaching out to slide open the top drawer. The first file she pulled out was an old one, filled with documents from a decade ago, nothing more than remnants of forgotten cases. But it wasn't what she was looking for. Her eyes narrowed as she moved to the second drawer, her fingers brushing over the smooth metal, before her gaze landed on something that made her stop dead in her tracks. A small, inconspicuous envelope, tucked away in the corner, its contents unmistakably familiar. Miss Marple's heart lurched as she gently opened the envelope, revealing a single photograph, a grainy image of Dr. Grant, standing alongside another person, their faces barely visible but unmistakable. The image was old, faded, but there was no mistaking the connection. Dr. Grant had been involved in something far more dangerous than anyone had realized. The other person in the photograph was none other than Blake. Her pulse quickened. There had been whispers of Dr. Grant's past, but this was something entirely different. The connection between Dr. Grant and Blake was not just professional, it was personal, and it ran deeper than Miss Marple had ever suspected. But there was something else. The handwriting on the back of the photo was familiar, the letters jagged but deliberate. It was a message. "She knows too much." The implications hit her like a thunderclap. Someone had been watching Dr. Grant, perhaps even manipulating her, using her as a pawn in a game of secrets. The truth was far more sinister than just a stolen manuscript. There were ties that ran far back, and the key to it all had been buried until now. Suddenly, there was a noise behind her, a sharp scraping sound, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Miss Marple whirled around, her heart hammering in her chest. But there was no one there, just the wind rattling against the window. But she wasn't fool enough to think it was an accident. The killer was still out there, and they were watching her. Every move she made, every word she spoke. Miss Marple pocketed the photograph with a cold determination, her mind already racing ahead, piecing the fragments together. The murderer was becoming bolder, more brazen. They had struck again, sending a clear message that the game wasn't over. And now it was a race against time, before another life was lost, before she became the next target. As she turned back toward the door, her thoughts were a whirlwind of strategy. There was no time to waste. She would need to dig deeper, unravel the truth, and confront the shadows that had been lurking all along. The investigation had taken a sharp turn, but Miss Marple was no longer on the back foot. It was her turn to take the lead, and this time there would be no escaping justice. Miss Marple walked through the dimly lit corridors of the police station, the photograph still tucked into her coat pocket, her thoughts spinning with the implications of what she had just uncovered. Dr. Grant's death was no longer an isolated tragedy. It was the keystone to a much larger puzzle, one that had been lying in plain sight all along. As the officers continued their work, Miss Marple found herself drawn back to the scene of the crime, Dr. Grant's body, now carefully covered and wheeled away for examination. She had already scrutinized the room for clues, but something kept pulling at her, an intangible sense that she had missed something crucial. The air around her felt charged, as if the room itself was hiding a secret. Her gaze swept across the floor, landing on a seemingly innocuous detail, a small puddle of ink near the door. It was almost imperceptible, but it caught her eye in a way that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Ink. The same ink that had been used to mark the pages of the manuscript. It was a subtle detail, but it made everything else fall into place in a flash. Miss Marple's mind clicked into high gear. She could see it now, the pattern that had been building under the surface. The manuscript, the poisoned ink, Dr. Grant's ties to Blake. It wasn't just about the murder of the archivist anymore. It was about a conspiracy that ran deeper than anyone had suspected. Dr. Grant hadn't just been a victim in this case. She had been part of something larger, something buried in the past that was now being dragged into the present. Her heart skipped as she remembered the photograph. The connection between Dr. Grant and Blake was undeniable, but it was more than just a professional link. The writing on the back of the photo, "She knows too much," had been a warning. Dr. Grant had uncovered something she wasn't supposed to, something that had been carefully hidden for years. And now, she was dead. Miss Marple's mind raced, trying to sort through the threads of the investigation. There had been so many leads, so many false starts, but this small, seemingly insignificant detail, the ink, was the one thing that had remained consistent throughout the case. It was a connection that no one else had noticed, not even the police. A small, seemingly trivial object had been the key to the puzzle all along. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the pieces fall into place. The ink, the poisoning, the murder. It was all part of the same design. The manuscript had been the catalyst, but it was never just about the manuscript. It had always been about the ink, the poisonous ink that had been used to mark the pages. Someone had wanted that ink for a reason. They wanted to keep it out of the wrong hands. They had wanted to stop Dr. Grant from learning the truth. But Miss Marple knew that the truth was never far behind. It was just a matter of time. She turned on her heel and made her way out of the station, her steps quick and purposeful. There was still much to do, much to uncover. But now she could see the shape of the case in its entirety. The ink had been the key all along, and it was time to follow that trail wherever it led. The streets were quiet as she made her way toward the last person who could provide answers. Blake. He had been the one who had started all of this, the one who had pushed Dr. Grant into the middle of it. And now he was the one who held the final piece of the puzzle. As Miss Marple approached his office, she could feel the weight of the investigation pressing down on her. Blake was no longer a suspect. He was the answer. It was time to put the final pieces together. But she also knew that this would be no easy confrontation. Blake had been clever, manipulating the people around him with the skill of a seasoned puppeteer. He wasn't going to give up his secrets easily. The door to Blake's office was slightly ajar when Miss Marple arrived, and she pushed it open quietly, stepping inside. The room was dimly lit, with shadows cast across the walls by the flickering light of a desk lamp. Blake was sitting behind his desk, his back to her, as though he was waiting for her to arrive. "I wondered when you'd show up," he said without turning around. His voice was smooth, almost indifferent, as though he knew exactly what she had come for. Miss Marple's heart pounded, but her voice remained calm. "You've been careful, Blake. Very careful. But you've overlooked something." Blake finally turned in his chair, his face unreadable. "And what might that be, Miss Marple?" "The ink," she replied simply. "The ink you've been so careful to hide. It's been in plain sight the entire time, and you thought no one would notice. But I did." Blake's eyes narrowed, a flicker of surprise flashing across his face, before he quickly masked it with a tight smile. "I'm not sure I follow." "Ink? What does that have to do with anything?" Miss Marple leaned forward, her gaze never leaving his face. "It has everything to do with it, Blake. The manuscript, the murder of Dr. Grant. It was all part of the same plan. You were trying to hide something dangerous, and the ink was your weapon." Blake's smile faltered, just for a moment. But it was enough. Miss Marple knew she had him. "You can't hide it anymore, Blake," she continued. "You thought the ink was your secret weapon. But now it's the one thing that's going to bring you down." There was a long, heavy silence between them as Blake stared at her, his expression hardening. Then he finally spoke, his voice low and cold. "You're too late, Miss Marple," he said, rising from his chair. "You've been following the wrong trail. The truth was never in the ink. It was always in the people who used it." Miss Marple took a step back, her instincts screaming. There was something else going on here, something she hadn't yet figured out. The pieces were all in place, but the puzzle wasn't complete. Blake had given her something, but it wasn't the truth, not yet. The game was far from over. Blake's words lingered in the air, a challenge Miss Marple couldn't ignore. His confident demeanor, though tinged with thinly veiled impatience, made it clear he believed he had won. Yet something in his tone, the way his posture had stiffened, when she mentioned the ink, told her the game had only just begun. Her mind was racing as she stood there, taking in his every move. Miss Marple knew there was more to this case than the surface suggested. The ink, the manuscript, the murder of Dr. Grant. Each piece had its place, but none of it explained the whole picture. Blake had carefully orchestrated his moves, but there was one element he hadn't anticipated. Her. "I've been doing this for years," Blake said, breaking the silence with a smirk. "I've been steps ahead of everyone else, even you, and now you're just another piece in my game." Miss Marple met his gaze steadily, unfazed by his arrogance. "A game, yes. But it's not the one you think, Blake. You've been hiding something, and you're not as clever as you believe." For the first time, a shadow of doubt crossed his expression. He hesitated, but only for a fraction of a second, before masking it with a flick of his hand. "You think you know everything, don't you? Well, let me tell you something you don't know. This whole thing was never about the manuscript. Not really." Miss Marple felt a jolt of recognition. The intensity in Blake's voice wasn't one of triumph. It was something else, something darker, more vulnerable, as though the veil of his carefully constructed facade was beginning to crack. "You're right," she said quietly, her voice steady. "It wasn't about the manuscript. It was about you." Blake Blake's eyes narrowed dangerously. What do you mean by that? The manuscript, the ink, Dr. Grant's death. They were all just tools. Tools to protect your real secret. But I've been wondering all along why you would go to such lengths to silence people. You're not driven by greed or revenge or the pursuit of power. No, it's something deeper. Blake's hand shot out, slamming against the desk. You're wrong. You don't know anything. Miss Marple remained calm, almost serene. You can lie to everyone else, but you can't lie to yourself, Blake. You've been running from something for years, something that's haunted you, and now you've taken it too far. Your guilt is eating you alive, and you can't escape it. Blake stepped back, his expression flickering between rage and disbelief. You don't know what you're talking about, don't I? Miss Marple's voice was soft, but the weight of her words seemed to hang in the air. She saw the briefest of movements in Blake's eyes, something primal, something that revealed a fracture in his calculated demeanor. She had hit a nerve. You're hiding behind your manipulations, your lies, because you can't bear to face the truth. But I think I've finally figured it out. You weren't trying to silence Dr. Grant because she was getting too close to your plans. You were trying to silence her because she was getting too close to the truth about you. Blake's face contorted with something akin to panic, his breath coming quicker, almost erratic. He took a step back, his fingers trembling as they clutched the edge of the desk. You don't know anything, he repeated, his voice hoarse. You're wrong. You have no idea what I've been through. The anger was gone now, replaced by something far more vulnerable. Fear. The mask was slipping, and for a fleeting moment, Miss Marple saw the full depth of Blake's turmoil. His carefully constructed world was unraveling. I know more than you think, she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. I know that the manuscript wasn't the only thing Dr. Grant uncovered. She uncovered your past, Blake. Your real past. And that's what you were willing to kill for. To keep buried. Blake's face twisted with something darker, something desperate. You don't understand. It was the only way. She had to die. All of them had to die. He choked on the words, his voice cracking with the weight of his confession. Miss Marple took a step closer, her gaze unwavering. What happened to you, Blake? What could possibly drive you to murder, to destroy lives, to cover up the truth? Blake laughed, a hollow, broken sound that echoed in the room. You think you know everything? You think this is about some petty motive like revenge or greed? No, this is about survival, about not becoming my father. The revelation hit Miss Marple like a thunderclap. It was as if the world around her had shifted. She had always suspected there was more to Blake than met the eye, but this was unexpected. Blake's father. The very name that had lingered at the edges of the case. The mysterious connection between the family's history and Blake's actions now made sense in ways Miss Marple could never have predicted. You don't understand, Blake muttered, his voice distant. I was just a boy when he died. He was a monster. He was a criminal, a killer. He destroyed everyone around him, and I was the one who had to clean up the mess. I promised myself I wouldn't be like him, that I wouldn't become him. But I was wrong. I was born like him. He looked up at Miss Marple then, his eyes wild with pain and fear. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't live with it. I thought I could bury it, that I could erase the past. But Dr. Grant was getting too close. She saw the cracks. She saw me for who I really was, and I couldn't let her expose that. I couldn't let anyone know the truth about my father, about what I was capable of. Miss Marple felt a shiver run down her spine as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Blake had been living a lie, desperately trying to outrun his heritage, the dark legacy of a father whose crimes had cast a shadow over his entire life. He had built a world of manipulation and control, trying to rewrite his story, to be something other than the monster he feared he might be. But the truth had always been lurking, waiting to be uncovered. And now, all of this— Miss Marple's voice trembled slightly, her understanding deepening. All of this has been about erasing your past, about killing the ghosts of your fathers, crimes before they could reach you. Blake let out a shaky breath. Yes, you understand now. That's why I did it. That's why I've done all of this. Miss Marple's heart ached for him, but her resolve didn't falter. She knew now that she had finally uncovered the heart of the matter. Blake's crimes weren't just about ambition or greed. They were the product of a soul consumed by guilt and fear, a man who had never been allowed to escape his past, who had spent his life running from it, only to realize that it had caught up with him. The detective had not only unraveled the mystery of Dr. Grant's death, but also the tragic truth behind Blake's relentless pursuit of control. And now, with the truth laid bare, there was only one thing left to do. Blake's confession hung in the air, heavy with regret and fear. Miss Marple could see the internal battle raging within him. His eyes darted to the door, then to the window, as if calculating the chances of escape, but his body remained rooted to the spot. The walls had closed in around him. There was nowhere to run. Not this time. She took a steadying breath, letting the weight of the moment settle. Her eyes never left him, and though her expression remained calm, there was a firmness in her gaze. Now, the game was up. The threads of Blake's carefully woven fabric had unraveled, and he could no longer hide behind his constructed lies. Blake's lips quivered as he took a step backward, then another, almost imperceptibly, like an animal ready to bolt. "You don't understand," he murmured, his voice breaking under the strain. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. I never wanted to hurt anyone. I had to protect myself." Miss Marple's voice was soft, but her words cut through the chaos that churned within him. "You didn't protect yourself, Blake. You destroyed everything and everyone who came too close to the truth. And now you'll have to face it." He laughed, though it was hollow and broken, an attempt to mask his fear. "You think you've got me figured out? You think you've won?" He shook his head, eyes wide with panic. "You don't know what I'm capable of. You don't know who I am." Miss Marple's gaze softened just for a moment, a hint of pity flashing across her features, but it was quickly replaced by the determination that had guided her through the entire case. "I know exactly who you are, Blake, and I know what you've done." The words struck him like a physical blow. He staggered back, his mind racing for an escape route, but the reality of his situation hit him all at once. There was no escape, no more lies to tell. She knew it all. The game was over. His breathing grew shallow, the sweat on his brow glistening under the harsh light of the room. He was unraveling piece by piece. Miss Marple could see the desperation in his eyes, but also something darker, something more dangerous. This was not just a man cornered by his crimes. This was a man who had been running for so long that he had forgotten how to stop. "You think I'm weak, don't you?" Blake spat, his voice rising in fury. You think I'm just some scared little boy hiding behind his father's legacy, but you're wrong. I'm stronger than you think. I'll make sure you don't walk out of here. No one will know the truth." Miss Marple's eyes never wavered, her calmness in stark contrast to the chaos Blake was trying to stir. She could feel the rising tension in the room, the pressure building between them like a live wire. But she had prepared for this moment. Blake's confession had already set the pieces in motion. "You've already said more than you realize," Miss Marple said quietly. "You're so terrified of your past that you're willing to destroy everything in your path to keep it buried. But you've just made one final mistake. You're no longer in control, Blake. You never were." The air in the room seemed to still for a moment as Blake's shoulders slumped, the fight beginning to leave him. "I never had control," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "Not really. Not since he died. Not since you made the decision to become him," Miss Marple finished for him, her voice sharp but not unkind. "You thought you could erase the past by killing those who knew the truth, by hiding behind your lies. But your father's shadow will never leave you, Blake. You can't outrun it." Blake's eyes darted to the door again, a flash of desperation crossing his face. He made a sudden movement, as if he might lunge toward the exit. But in that instant, a sharp knock echoed from the hallway, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, too many to be ignored. Blake froze. "Do you think you're the only one with secrets?" Miss Marple asked softly, her eyes never leaving his. "Do you really think you're the only one who can manipulate others, twist the truth to your advantage?" Blake's chest rose and fell rapidly, his mind spinning with the implications. "What? What are you talking about?" "You're not the only one who knows how to pull strings, Blake," Miss Marple said, her voice barely above a whisper now, but with a firm edge that sent a chill down his spine. "You're not the only one who can outwit a criminal. Your carefully constructed lies have crumbled, and now it's time for you to face the consequences of your actions." The sound of the footsteps grew louder, unmistakable now. Blake's eyes widened, and for the first time since his confession, a flicker of true fear crossed his face. He knew, in that moment, that his carefully constructed world was collapsing, that the walls had closed in around him. It wasn't just Miss Marple who had outsmarted him. It was the entire web of deceit he had woven for so long. Without warning, Blake lunged toward the door, his panic overriding any rational thought. But as he reached for the handle, a voice from the hallway called out, stopping him dead in his tracks. "Blake, stop!" It was a firm, authoritative voice. The voice of the constable, the very one who had been shadowing Miss Marple from the moment she arrived. Blake froze, his hand gripping the doorknob as if it were his only lifeline. The constable appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable but resolute. "It's over, Blake. We have you now." Blake let out a strangled laugh, his mind no longer working in coherent thoughts. "No," he whispered, his breath coming in ragged bursts. "You don't understand. I was trying to protect myself. I had to do it." Miss Marple took a slow step forward, her eyes never leaving him. "Protect yourself from what, Blake? The truth. You've been running from your own shadow for far too long, but it's caught up with you now." For a long moment, Blake simply stood there, his hand still clenched around the doorknob, as though trying to will himself to escape. But he knew deep down there was no way out. The trap had been set, and he had walked straight into it. The constable stepped forward, his hand reaching for Blake's arm. You're under arrest for the murders of Dr. Grant and the others. Anything you say can and will be used against you." Blake sagged under the weight of his inevitable fate. The fight had gone out of him, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he simply surrendered. The last of his defenses crumbled, and Miss Marple saw it in his eyes. The acceptance that this was the end. The trap had been set, and Blake had fallen right into it. The handcuffs clicked shut around Blake's wrists, and he sagged slightly, the tension draining from his body. The constable guided him toward the door, his eyes lingering on Miss Marple for a brief moment before he stepped into the hallway, his voice firm and steady. "We'll take it from here, Miss Marple," he said, his tone a mixture of respect and finality. "You've done your part. It's over." But as the door swung shut behind them, the weight of the words, "It's over," hung in the air, an uneasy echo that Miss Marple could not shake. She felt no triumph, no sense of closure. Instead, a quiet unease gnawed at her, a feeling that something wasn't quite right. Blake's defeat was complete, and yet something, some small, elusive detail, kept gnawing at her thoughts. She paced the room, her hands clasped behind her back, eyes scanning the cluttered desk and the scattered notes that now seemed irrelevant. The case was wrapped up, but there was a deeper sense of discomfort in her gut, one that couldn't be explained by Blake's confession alone. As she moved toward the window, her gaze fixed on the horizon, something caught her attention, the faintest movement in the shadows. Her heart skipped a beat. No one should have been in the room anymore. The constable had taken Blake to the station. She turned sharply, her mind racing. She wasn't alone. A figure stepped from behind a shadowed alcove, his presence so sudden that it took Miss Marple a moment to recognize him. It was Mr. Hayes, the lawyer who had been so calm and collected throughout the investigation. He was now standing in the middle of the room, his face twisted in a mixture of guilt and fear. "You," Miss Marple started, her voice tight with surprise. "What are you doing here?" Hayes didn't respond immediately. Instead, he walked slowly toward her, his footsteps deliberate, his demeanor strangely composed despite the situation. "I suppose I owe you an explanation," he said, his voice low and steady. Miss Marple's mind whirred. Hayes, the lawyer. She had considered him a mere player in the background of the case, someone whose role was limited to overseeing legal matters, perhaps making sure Blake stayed out of prison for as long as possible. She had dismissed him as a minor figure. But now, standing before her, there was something about his calm that unsettled her. "I don't understand," she said, her eyes narrowing. "What are you trying to tell me?" Hayes's lips curved into a bitter smile. "It was always going to be me, wasn't it? You thought Blake was the mastermind. You thought he was the one pulling the strings. But you didn't see the whole picture. You never did." Miss Marple felt a cold shiver race down her spine, and her mind began to churn with the possibilities. Hayes had been too calm, too sure of himself. The way he had always kept a distance from the investigation, the way he had seemed so indifferent to Blake's fate, it suddenly clicked. There had always been something just a little off about him. "You were the one behind it all," she murmured, more to herself than to him, the realization dawning with an almost suffocating clarity. You were the one pulling the strings, the poison in the ink, the deception, the manipulation. It was you all along. Hayes nodded, though there was no triumph in his expression, only resignation. I didn't want it to go this far. I thought I could control it. But you don't. Realize how far someone will go to protect themselves, how far they'll go to keep their past buried. Miss Marple's mind raced as the pieces began to fall into place. She had been so focused on Blake, on the immediate clues, that she had missed the larger picture. Hayes had played the part of a passive observer, a bystander in the drama unfolding before her. But in truth, he had been its orchestrator. He had known Blake's secrets long before Miss Marple had come into the picture. And when the investigation began to edge closer to the truth, Hayes had made sure to guide it away from himself, using Blake as a scapegoat. "You were the one with the motive," Miss Marple said, her voice sharp now. "You were the one who had the most to lose. Blake was nothing but a pawn in your game, a distraction." Hayes's eyes flickered, a brief moment of emotion crossing his face. "You don't understand," he said, his voice cracking for the first time. "I didn't want it to happen this way, but my father, he wasn't the man everyone thought he was. He did things, horrible things, and I couldn't live with it. I couldn't let Blake or anyone find out the truth." Miss Marple stood motionless, absorbing his confession. Hayes wasn't just trying to protect his own interests. He was trying to bury the skeletons of his past, the ones that had haunted him for years. It wasn't just money or power he had been after. It was the need to erase everything his father had done. His twisted sense of duty had driven him to manipulate, to kill, and to deceive anyone who might come too close to the truth. "You never wanted anyone to discover what you and your father had done," Miss Marple said, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "You orchestrated everything. Blake's involvement, the murders, the confusion. You used him as your shield, as your scapegoat, and now, with him behind bars, you thought you had won. But you didn't," Hayes whispered. "You won't understand. Not yet. I didn't have a choice. The truth would have ruined everything. It would have torn apart everything I've built. It was the only way." The silence in the room was suffocating. Miss Marple could feel the weight of his words pressing in on her, but she wasn't done yet. She could see the cracks in his facade, the last desperate attempts to hold on to the life he had built on lies. It was all unraveling now, but there was something more to this, something more than just his father's past. "You think Blake is the one who deserves to pay for everything, don't you?" Miss Marple said quietly, stepping closer to him, her gaze never leaving his. "But the truth is, you were the one who set all of this in motion. You were the one who made sure the poison was in the ink. You were the one who pulled the strings from the shadows." Hayes's face twitched, his composure slipping for a fraction of a second. "I never wanted anyone to die," he said, his voice faltering. "But I couldn't let the past come back to haunt me. And yet, here we are," Miss Marple said softly. "The past always catches up with you, Mr. Hayes. It always has a way of making itself known, even when you think you've buried it for good." For a long moment, Hayes stood there, his body sagging with the weight of his own guilt. Then, slowly, almost reluctantly, he raised his head, meeting Miss Marple's gaze. "You'll never prove it," he said, his voice cold again, the faintest trace of defiance lingering in his words. "There's nothing you can do. No one will believe you," Blake confessed. Miss Marple's eyes flickered to the door. "Perhaps," she said quietly, "but I have a few more tricks up my sleeve." And with that, The final piece of the puzzle snapped into place. The hours following her conversation with Mr. Hayes felt like an eternity, the weight of his confession still lingering in the air. Miss Marple had no doubt now that Blake had been merely a pawn in a far more intricate scheme, one that had spanned years, built on hidden guilt, and wrapped itself in lies so tightly that no one, not even the authorities, had seen it for what it truly was. She stood in the dimly lit office, her mind sifting through the fragments of the case. Hayes had been too confident. His self-assurance in the face of her accusations had been his undoing. He had thought the web he'd spun was tight, enough to keep the truth contained, but Miss Marple had seen the unraveling threads. The first clue had been in the details. The ink poisoning, so cleverly hidden in the simplest of objects, had always felt too obvious in its obscurity. It was as though someone wanted the authorities to stumble upon it and dismiss it as a strange coincidence, an error rather than a deliberate act. That had been Hayes's plan, to confuse, to mislead, and to let someone else take the fall. But the second clue, something Miss Marple hadn't even considered until moments before, had been the documents in Blake's study. At first, they had seemed like typical legal papers, contracts, client files, and the usual jumble of professional detritus. But when Miss Marple had carefully examined them again, the truth had jumped out at her, as obvious as the morning sun. There had been one document among them that had never been properly explained, an unsigned letter, half-written and crumpled in the corner of the desk drawer. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was Hayes's own. But it wasn't just any letter. It was a confession. It wasn't just a confession of the murder. It was a confession of everything. His father's dark dealings, the manipulation of Blake, and the cold calculation behind every step. It had all been right there in front of her, hidden in plain sight. Now, as Miss Marple stood at the window, watching the rain trickle down the glass, she couldn't help but feel that nagging sense of unfinished business. She had caught him, there was no doubt of that. She had pieced together the puzzle, and Hayes had no more lies to hide behind. But justice, it seemed, had not yet been served, not entirely. The constable entered, his face grim. "He's gone, Miss Marple," he said quietly. "We searched everywhere, but he's disappeared. There's no sign of him anywhere, no trace." Miss Marple's heart sank. Hayes had been too clever, too prepared. He had known that the walls were closing in on him. And in that final moment, when the truth was within reach, he had vanished like a shadow into the night. She felt the sting of defeat, but quickly dismissed it. Hayes hadn't won, not yet. He might have escaped this time, but she knew that the truth would catch up with him. It always did. The law might not have caught him in the act, but his past had a way of clawing its way to the surface. The guilt he carried would never let him rest. Miss Marple had seen this pattern before. "Don't worry, Constable," she said, her voice calm and steady. "He'll slip up eventually. The past has a way of catching up with people like him." The constable nodded, but his expression was troubled. "What if he doesn't? What if he's gone for good?" Miss Marple turned to face him, her eyes sharp. "Even if he is gone, there are clues we haven't uncovered yet. His time will come." The constable lingered a moment longer before leaving, and Miss Marple remained by the window, staring out into the endless rain. There was a lingering unease in the air, a sense that the story wasn't quite finished yet. Something was missing. Something just beyond her grasp. Then, As if the universe had finally decided to reveal the last piece, a single letter arrived at the door. It was addressed to Miss Marple, the handwriting unmistakable. Hayes had sent it himself, perhaps as a final, taunting gesture, a way to remain in control, even in his defeat. She opened it with a sense of inevitability, the paper crackling as she unfolded it. The letter was short, almost curt. "You may have won this round, Miss Marple, but the game is far from over. The past never stays buried forever. It will come for you, just as it came for me. Remember that." Miss Marple set the letter down, her gaze lingering on the words. There was no sense of triumph in her heart. Hayes had escaped, yes, but the case was not closed. There was more to uncover, more that would emerge as time wore on. She knew he would be back, just as certain as the dawn. She glanced back at the desk, her mind already moving toward the next step. The evidence had been hidden in plain sight, but there was one final detail, one last truth, that she had yet to uncover. It wasn't over. Not yet. And as the rain continued to fall, Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself. Justice had been delayed, but it would come, just as it always did. The rain had stopped by the time Miss Marple left the office, but the lingering tension in the air clung to her like a heavy mist. She walked slowly, her footsteps muffled by the quiet streets of the village. The case of Blake's murder and the vanishing of Mr. Hayes was, on the surface, resolved. Yet there was something in the back of Miss Marple's mind that refused to settle. She had been right about Hayes. His confession, written in the hastily crumpled letter, had provided the final piece to a puzzle that had twisted in front of her eyes for weeks. The signs had always been there. The overconfidence in his lies, the perfect way in which he had woven himself into the narrative, the subtle inconsistencies that only a sharp eye could catch. And yet now, despite knowing the criminal's identity, a small, nagging detail bothered her. As she passed by the church, its towering spire cutting through the night sky, her mind drifted back to something that had struck her during one of her visits to the crime scene. There had been a strange smell in Blake's office, faint but distinct. At the time she had assumed it was the musty scent of old paper, but now that she thought about it more carefully, it had been something else, something chemical. The ink had been tampered with, yes, but had something else been used to mask? The scent of the poison. A faint, almost imperceptible hint of something floral. It was subtle, like a memory that danced at the edge of her mind, but wouldn't quite come into focus. She pushed the thought aside. It could have been a coincidence, a figment of her imagination, but she didn't think so. Miss Marple knew better than to let her suspicions go unexamined. Her thoughts were interrupted as she reached the end of the lane, where the small cottage she called home stood quiet and unassuming. The house was a reflection of her. Modest, comfortable, yet always observing, always waiting for the next detail to reveal itself. She stepped inside, the warmth of the fire greeting her. For a moment she stood in the doorway, allowing herself a few moments of peace before diving back into the mystery. But peace was fleeting. There, on the small wooden table near the hearth, was an envelope. A plain, unmarked one. But her name was written in a familiar hand. The handwriting was unmistakable, Hayes. Her heart skipped a beat as she sat down, carefully tearing open the envelope. Inside she found nothing but a single, neatly folded piece of paper. Miss Marple unfolded it. her fingers barely trembling as she read the cryptic message scrawled inside. "I thought you might like to know, Miss Marple. The ink you so carefully examined was only the beginning. There's more to this story than you realize. The answers you seek are closer than you think. Just look closer." A chill ran down her spine. She had been right. There was something she had missed, something important, something hidden in plain sight. Hayes may have been gone, but his message, his challenge, was clear. She leaned back in her chair, the fire crackling softly in the corner of the room. Her eyes narrowed, the sharpness in them returning. Her mind immediately went back to the letter, to the cryptic words that lingered on the page. There was something in them, something she hadn't quite caught. The ink, she thought again. The ink that had been poisoned. The ink that had almost led to Blake's death. The ink that had been the thread that tied everything together. And, yet, she hadn't looked closely enough at the paper itself. Had she? Miss Marple stood suddenly, her chair scraping against the floor as she made her way to the small desk by the window. The room, though quiet, felt filled with the weight of the mystery, and she couldn't ignore the pulling sensation in her chest, the need to examine every detail, even the smallest ones. With careful hands, she retrieved the letter she had found at the crime scene, the one Hayes had left behind, the one he had thought would be his final confession. She placed it side by side with the letter she had just received, and it was then that she saw it. Something she hadn't noticed before. The ink on both pieces of paper was the same. Not in its content, but in the way it had been applied. It wasn't just any ink. It was a rare, almost impossibly expensive ink, a brand used only by certain high-end printers. And there, just beneath the surface of both letters, a faint, almost invisible pattern had been carved into the paper itself. Miss Marple's pulse quickened as she examined the edges. The pattern was intricate, a series of carefully etched lines that formed what could only be described as a map of something hidden, something never meant to be seen. She traced her finger along the lines, her mind racing as the realization hit her with the force of a thunderclap. The ink, the pattern, the map. It was a clue. But where did it lead? Suddenly she understood. The mystery wasn't over. Hayes hadn't just confessed. He had left her a final trail to follow, one that would lead her deeper into a web of secrets far darker and more complex than she could have imagined. Miss Marple stared at the paper for a moment longer before standing up with purpose. The fire in her hearth crackled loudly, as if in agreement. The mystery that had consumed her was far from finished. It was merely taking a new turn, one that she would follow to the end, wherever it might lead. And as the moonlight danced on the surface of the paper, Miss Marple smiled, her eyes gleaming with the knowledge that a detective's work was never done. The answers she sought were just out of reach, but she knew she would find them, because every clue, no matter how small, eventually revealed its truth. And for Miss Marple, truth was always just a step away. The case was never truly over. There would always be another layer to uncover, another mystery to solve, and she would be there, waiting, with a mind as sharp as ever, to solve it.